Hi, folks, and welcome to week 2 on demographics, disease, and the Shatter Zone. As usual, here's our list of learning objectives. Let's start with this general observation. However you measure it, the indigenous peoples of the Americas suffered a massive demographic collapse as a result of colonization. Now, before we go any further, I want to be clear about what this famous graph on the does and does not represent. Obviously, it represents population estimates, but that is in terms of counting individual people. It's not counting people in the collective sense of the term. Tribes, chiefdoms, confederacies, bands, language groups. There are a number of different ways indigenous peoples imagine themselves. We have absolutely no idea of how many peoples in this collective sense have gone extinct. Much like we're seeing a precipitous decline in biodiversity in our current era of the Anthropocene, we're still in the midst of an irrevocable loss of cultural diversity around the world. So that's what this graph doesn't represent. Instead, the demographic debate has been framed in terms of very raw population estimates, i.e., individuals, not groups. As far as North America is concerned, the author of Reading 1, Cherokee historian Russell Thornton, favors the higher end of a range of estimates, no more than 7 million from northern Mexico to Greenland. If that's the rough figure at the starting point in 1492, then it reached the nadir around 1900. That's the low point on the top graph, when in the US alone, there were less than 250,000 native peoples left. Continentally, we're talking about a 95% population loss over the course of 4 centuries. Now, the bottom graph represents the dramatic demographic rebound of Native America's story of survivance, keyword from last week. Continuing that part of our discussion, the enduring survivance of indigenous peoples was central to the so-called Indian problem. More on that next week. Right now, we're looking at the demographic consequences of colonial encounters. According to another set of estimates, the overall population loss across the entire 17th century alone was anywhere between 4.5 and 14.4 million. We're talking about massive death tolls here, millions of people. So, what accounts for such terrible loss of humanity? It's widely believed that diseases were the primary, if not sole cause of depopulation. This type of explanation is known as the virgin soil thesis. This refers to epidemics in which populations at risk have had no previous contact with the diseases that strike them and are therefore immunologically almost defenseless. Primary culprits in the colonization of the New World include smallpox, measles, malaria, pneumonia, influenza, tuberculosis, yellow fever, and undoubtedly many others. That such diseases caused depopulation is fairly well documented, although the virgin soil thesis goes further by often depicting epidemics as almost invariably spreading like wildfire, just completely out of control, destroying everything in its path. Now, before we pick this thesis apart, we should acknowledge that this is a real-world problem, even today, especially for the many indigenous peoples who continue to live in voluntary isolation, mostly in Brazil, Peru, Bolivia, Venezuela, Ecuador, Colombia, and Paraguay. Those indigenous peoples living in isolation still deal with the threat of disease. In one notorious example, no more than half a century ago, a brief encounter between some loggers and a group of indigenous peoples in the Peruvian Amazon exposed them to a common cold, resulting in a contagion that killed nearly 300 people, amounting to a nearly 40 to 60% population loss for the group. This was in the 1980s, when it's worth noting that Peru was in the midst of a long civil war, and that only 3 years after this incident, an entire village of a completely different group of indigenous peoples was massacred by the Peruvian military. So, context is important. We just can't look at diseases in isolation. I'm saying all this because I don't want to minimize the stakes. Instead, we're really concerned with how the virgin soil thesis has been oversimplified as it's become popularized. Our key critique is that VST minimizes the complexity and multi-causality of depopulation, yet the common folk wisdom reduces all this down to a single explanation, that it was germs that killed all the Indians. Critical theorists would call this the sedimentation of meaning, as the virgin soil thesis is so widely taken for granted that it's hardly ever seriously questioned. Here are some popular titles that are emblematic of the VST thesis. I should say that I really enjoyed reading Jared Diamond back in the day. Now I know better, largely because of Reading 2, the author of which just so happens to have a PhD in history as well as an MD. From this position, we can critique VST as a form of immunological determinism. As the author explains, stark emphasis on powerful and inevitable forces of natural selection tacitly gestures to the enduring appeal of social Darwinism, perhaps in a subtler form. This form of determinism also ignores the inherent complexities of epidemiology by downplaying most other factors, biological and social, that contribute to depopulation. The author adds that by ignoring the social factors that created disease during the colonial encounter, VST made it easier to ignore those same factors where they operate today. In this context, we could talk about the concepts of structural violence, slow death, or genocide by attrition. VST is also just flat out incorrect in both a bioarchaeological sense and a biomedical sense. It's incorrect to assume that American Indians had not been previously exposed to many diseases. In certain cases, that was devastatingly true, but analysis of skeletal remains has shown that the concept of a pristine, disease-free, pre-Columbian New World environment is no longer credible. Moreover, this quote-unquote virginity did not leave Indians immunologically almost defenseless. With the exception of people with autoimmune disorders or whatever, the author clarifies that all humans are capable of defending themselves against disease. Claims of quote-unquote no immunity are baseless. Finally, we must critique the ideological functions of VST because it deflects attention from a broad range of other factors, including large macro-level socioeconomic structures that continue to operate. Later in the presentation, for example, we'll see how the Mississippian Shatter Zone framework considers regional integration into the nascent modern capitalist system as one of several crucial factors in the depopulation of the native South. Yet by avoiding such complex factors, VST also perpetuates myths of settler innocence. It's like we didn't do anything, it's just nature. Likewise, it props up Eurocentric fantasies like the international legal principles of terra nullius, which was used to claim lands imagined to be empty. Any part of U.S. property that wasn't ceded from Indians was claimed according to this principle, as in California. Remember, dispossession is foundational to the American settler colonial project. Thankfully, there is an ongoing historiographical shift and explanatory power away from VST that's being driven by a growing body of scholarship in paleoepidemiology, archaeology, biological anthropology, and ethnohistory. This scholarship pushes back against the undue weight afforded to epidemics, as well as the overgeneralized claims of virgin soil epidemics spreading indiscriminately like wildfire. Rather, the spread of disease may have been restricted to specific regions or locales. New evidence, particularly settlement pattern data, demographic shift and depopulation, aberrant mortuary patterns such as mass graves, and osteoarchaeological markers suggest that disease did not necessarily entail demographic collapse, at least not all at once. Moreover, this new literature stresses multi-causality, both in terms of epidemiological factors, but also social, economic, and political factors. Epidemiologically, it's not just about levels of immunity, which was the sole focus of VST. It's also the virulence of the pathogen. Some diseases are more lethal than others, and if a disease kills too many in the host population too quickly, then its virulence can actually limit its spread. There's also timing, both in terms of comorbidities, but also with repeated waves of illnesses. Population size, density, and distribution are also important factors here. And then there are all sorts of other non-epidemiological factors, most of which we'll discuss next. But this last point here bears emphasis, particularly in terms of low birth rates and high infant mortality rates. The very young and the very old are most at risk of dying from disease. These just happen to be the populations that promise the future and remember the past. So there are serious cultural ramifications to epidemiology that are especially relevant. Emblematic of this historiographical shift is the Mississippian Shatter Zone, which provides a multifaceted way of thinking about disease alongside these other factors. The Shatter Zone is a historical framework that explains how the indigenous peoples of the North American Southeast were radically transformed by colonialism. So consider this. When the Spanish conquistador, Hernando de Soto, led an expedition through the Southeast from 1539 to 42, he encountered a series of complex indigenous chiefdoms. These Mississippian-era polities had existed for nearly 600 years already, and they were almost like quasi-states, as evidenced by their impressive burial mounds and defensive earthworks. By the early 18th century, and out of their shattered remnants, new coalescent societies emerged through processes of ethnogenesis, or group formation, a concept that was referenced last week. Native Southerners rebuilt their communities and constructed new social and political organizations using some social institutions that resembled those of their victims. In Reading 5, historical anthropologist Robbie Etheridge presents the Shatter Zone framework. This accounts for the multiple factors responsible for the depopulation and transformation of indigenous peoples, specifically in the Southeast, but we can generally apply this framework elsewhere. The first factor was the structural instability of Mississippian chiefdoms as a political system. The Mississippian world was based on a tributary economy, not entirely unlike feudal Europe, and the colonial co-option and eventual replacement of this economy entailed the ultimate collapse of these hierarchically structured polities. The second factor was disease, which we've already covered, although it bears reiterating that there was no single epidemic that swept across the entire southeastern region, at least not until 1696. But even that particular smallpox epidemic was subject to the vicissitudes of the historical moment. As was the case, there were more localized outbreaks of disease, which spread over a longer time and with greater local variability. Third was the integration of the region into the nascent capitalist economic system dominated by Europeans through the commercial trade in animal skins and Indian slaves, the latter of which was an inherently violent activity that was prone to geographical diffusion. The introduction of a new, commercialized incentive structure led to overhunting, both of furs and slaves, both of which led to the fourth and perhaps most relevant factor, the intensification and spread of violence and warfare, particularly through the emergence of militaristic slaving societies who held control of the Indian slave trade, at least until the early 18th century, at which point the transatlantic slave trade increased to such volume as to make the Indian slave trade obsolete. But it's important to understand that the Mississippian Shatter Zone was just one of many shock waves set off throughout the colonization of North America, as seen in Reading 6 and especially 7. Over the course of history, going back to the Neolithic Revolution, the expansion of empire states has radically transformed indigenous or tribal patterns of warfare. Such radical transformation was especially evident in the European colonization of North America, where the result of imperial state expansion and capitalist incorporation was the militarization of indigenous peoples through an increase, intensification, and transformation of indigenous warfare on the edges of empire. In this context, indigenous people and sometimes created colonial violence, often building upon pre-contact patterns of warfare and enslavement/adoption, the latter of which involved captives replacing lost kin in the captor's society, as we saw with the Haudenosaunee, aka the Iroquois Confederacy. Across the colonial shatter zones of North America, Native groups used violence as a strategy of group survival. This was especially the case for the Iroquois Confederacy, which faced an unprecedented set of challenges with the French colonial incursion into the St. Lawrence River Valley of the Northeast, which unlocked the deep interior of the Great Lakes up to the Hudson Bay, potentially opening up a vast boreal forest region rich with furs and pelts that were in great demand in European metropolitan centers. The Wendat, aka the Huron, were similar in size and structure to the Iroquois, even speaking an Iroquois dialect themselves, and their homeland was strategically located right in the middle of the burgeoning fur trade that was integrating the region into the global political economy. The Iroquois They faced additional challenges after a series of epidemics in the 1630s reduced Iroquois numbers. In response, Iroquois war parties pushed into Wendake and began targeting Wendats for captivity, pursuant to a traditional practice known as requickening, whereby captives were adopted into Iroquois society in order to replenish their population losses. By the 1640s, the Iroquois were cementing their hegemonic status in the region at the expense of the Wendat, culminating in a series of extraordinarily violent assaults on Wendake in 1648. This was a completely novel form of indigenous warfare, as the projection of overwhelming violence, facilitated of course by the introduction of modern weaponry, aimed to destroy the Wendat. Over the following decade, other indigenous groups were either dispersed, incorporated, or exterminated by the Iroquois, setting off ripple effects that reverberated across the continent. Many native groups were destroyed or dispersed, with remnant populations migrating and/or seeking refuge with other indigenous groups. Some of these refugees gained access to firearms and became militaristic slaving societies themselves, displacing their experience of colonial violence onto others. An example of this was a group known as the Westos, who were originally displaced from the Great Lakes region by the Iroquois. Around the mid-17th century, they migrated down to the southeast, first to Virginia, then to Carolina, where the burgeoning English colonial plantation complex generated an insatiable demand for forced laborers. Beginning in 1659, the Westos began supplying this market using modern weaponry to assault Spanish mission provinces in northern Florida, effectively mass enslavement and mass population movements. Yet, the Westo alliance with the English was short-lived, as was their monopoly on firearms in the Indian slave trade. And in 1680, at the behest of colonial powers in Carolina, a new group of refugee Indians, particularly a group of Shawnees known as the Savannah Indians, were enlisted into a campaign of Indian groups serving the role of slavers, as well as a series of geopolitical entanglements that further destabilized the region. Most notably, Queen Anne's War was the American theater of the larger War of Spanish Secession, and it provided the context for the continued escalation of colonial-induced slave raiding in Spanish Florida during the first decade of the 18th century, pushing deeper and deeper into central and southern Florida, nearly emptying the entire peninsula of its indigenous populations, all the way down to the Keys. One of the most notorious episodes in this context was the 1704 assault by the combined British Creek forces against the Appalachian people, who were living in Spanish mission towns further north actually, in the Panhandle region. Hundreds were killed outright, some even brutally tortured beforehand, and an unknown number were taken captive and forced into slavery, the rest exiled and absorbed into other indigenous groups. Like so many other indigenous peoples lost to the Shatter Zone, the Appalachians were extinguished as a society. Soon enough, the Spanish missions in Florida were so depopulated that militaristic slaving societies eventually ran out of sources, leaving them unable to repay debts to colonists. This economic downturn precipitated the 1715 Yamasee War, the causes of which were complex and confusing, but the results of which were devastating, both for South Carolinian settlers and indigenous groups alike. The destabilizing effects of this war ended the Indian slave trade and paved the way for the dramatic 18th century boom, the transatlantic slave complex. Okay, once again, I'm just going to end rather abruptly here, in the hopes of picking this up on the discussion forum. Don't forget about our usual assignments, including next week's abstract proposal for the paper, which is going to be on a topic of your choosing. My parameters are pretty broad, so I'm open to working with your interest. I offer a few suggestions on the syllabus, and I'm happy to brainstorm, so please reach out to me to discuss. Anyways, thanks for listening.